Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to TPOG, the podcast of gaming, presented by TBOG. I am joined here today for episode 4 with my good friends Cora,
Howdy, howdy.
Nixon,
Hello there.
and Max.
Salutations.
Today's subject is game adaptations. Now, we have a lot to discuss in regards to how media from all across the spectrum, comic books, TV shows, movies, radio plays, whatever you might think of, have been adapted into games, and then the reverse as well, how games have found themselves adapted into those media. And we're going to be going over a little bit of some of the more prominent and famous and infamous game adaptations from throughout history, our opinions on some of our favourites, etc., etc. Going to have a bit more of an open discussion today and just see where we go with this topic. So, why don't we start off by discussing some games that have been adapted to other media? So we're going to talk about things like, the Witcher TV show, or Cyberpunk Edge Runners, to a couple of more recent examples, the Super Mario Brothers movie, anything like that. Just anything in that direction we'll kick off with. So why don't we start off with you, Max, since I know you had a couple of things you wanted to discuss.
So I had a few different adaptations in mind. Specifically the ones that I came into this with were like ones that were made sort of early in these series, like the ones that started in the 80s. These would have been like things that came out around the same time as the first few games in those series, things like that. Because the thing I find really interesting with these early adaptations is how a lot of the brand restrictions we have in place and a lot of the brand identity we have with a lot of these sort of series now. They weren't really established back then, or not too clearly established, not too clearly enforced, because these series were really new at the time. So, they had to get pretty experimental in a lot of places that you might not see in a modern adaptation. And I just thought a lot of that stuff was really interesting. Most of them in ways I like. I do have like most of the ones I have lined up are ones that I have a lot of good things to say about. But yeah, that's sort of the theme for most of the adaptations I have in mind. To talk about today.
A lot of my topics more focus on either stuff that I saw in my early childhood or stuff that I've seen recently. Um, in my opinion, these kind of adaptations are either great or terrible. Like I'm sure that there are some average ones in between. Um, Especially when it comes to kid shows. I'm sure we remember like the Donkey Kong series adaptation, or I think it was like Kirby Right Back at You, which I find to be like middle of the road. But outside of those that are like geared towards children, especially like blockbuster films or like higher budget shows and movies, they're fairly binary in their quality, in my opinion.
I mostly have some. I actually have ones that I believe to be more mediocre than good. Although I do have a few good ones lined up as well, and I have one that I absolutely have despised throughout after it came out for some reasons. But I do agree with the sentiment of usually they tend to be either really good or really really bad. Like they completely miss the mark on the original series or how to actually build the story.
That's interesting to hear because I feel like historically these adaptations were always known as to be they were either okay or utter dog shit. As far as I was concerned, I think in recent years, definitely the attitude has changed. But if I think back to the 2000s, the 90s, you had things like the Super Mario Brothers movie, the Mortal Kombat movie, the Street Fighter movie. You had obviously Tomb Raider, which was like okay. I don't think anyone's gonna say it's like an Oscar winner, but it did the job sort of thing. But it's quite interesting to hear you say that generally they have a reputation of either being really good or really bad, whereas I kind of felt like historically it was just meh or bad, really, at least in my experience.
Yeah, perhaps my lens is a bit warped by the fact of like some of the old stuff that I thought was good was also because it was like IP that the child version of myself really enjoyed. So obviously I was just gonna like any of it, especially if it was like referential media where it was like I was just waiting for the character to do the thing, and the whole movie was like, oh, he did the thing, he finally did the thing, and I was like, oh, that's a great movie. And then if I didn't have that connection, I'd be like, oh, this movie's bad. But probably in you probably have a lot of credence to your statement where they were all like 6 or below, and it's only been the last couple years where that idea has changed when we've got some very high rated adaptations in the past 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah, because oh, sorry, go ahead, Max.
Oh, all right. So what I was about to say was, and in my case, yeah, there was like a really long period, throughout the '90s and 2000s where, you would see like game adaptations generally regarded as being like really, really bad, and like, and here's the thing: the top 10 on pretty much all of those is like Western film adaptations, and I do agree, like most if not all of those are still like really bad, but like the ones I had in mind to talk about were like the ones that were adapted into like serialized anime or manga, the things where they have more than one work to actually flesh things out, things like that. So those weren't the series that I had in mind. Sorry, not the series, like those sort of standard films everybody knows about. Those weren't the ones that I had in mind to talk about today.
The Resident Evil discussions.
God, we could go on about Resident Evil a while now. We've had a fair few adaptations at this point, haven't we? Obviously, you got the Paul W.S. Anderson movies. I think there were 6 of those, but now we've got 2 recent adaptations, I believe. One from Netflix, and the other I can't remember who made it, but it's called like Welcome to Raccoon City or something. They do like adapting that series, and to my knowledge, none of them have been particularly great. Maybe the animated CGI movies, but they weren't really direct game adaptations. So Degeneration, Damnation, I can't remember what the other one was called, but they were sort of like extensions to the universe rather than straight up adapting the games themselves. But in my, those some of those later Resident Evil movies are pretty fucking dreadful. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the 5th one. I can't remember what it's called, but it's the one with Barry Burton in, the one with Leon Kennedy, and they just appear out of absolutely nowhere with all these characters from the games, and they're just really, really, really bad. It's some of the worst acting I've seen in my life. It's don't know what it is about that franchise that they just cannot get it right, no matter what they do.
Yeah, and then they went and polluted Monster Hunter as well. Yeah, I don't think I've watched any after the 3rd one, even though they're pretty entertaining to see on an airplane or something when you're just like stuck in there and you want something very light that you don't have to pay attention to.
I mean, I will always maintain that the first one is a good movie, but it's so far removed from Resident Evil that it may as well just be its own IP. It's like the only things that really are there is the Umbrella Corporation and the T-Virus, and that's about it, really. There's no characters from the games in that movie. It's just a good zombie movie. That's all it is, really, at the end of the day. And it's got a really nice soundtrack, it's got some memorable moments in it, but it's so far removed from the source material, it may as well not even be associated with it. But the further on the series went, the more they associated themselves with the original games, and it just seemed to get worse. And I'm not saying there's like a causality there, but that's just how I think it went, and certainly I think the IMDb scores would support me on that statement.
Yeah, the first movie might have had all the good ideas packed into one little neat package. Not to play moderator, but Max, I would love to hear, since this seems like your wheelhouse, a little bit of background information of what you kind of called the Wild West of the early adaptations before the lawmakers kind of clamped down on it, because I don't have a lot of experience with it.
Right. So I don't want to say lawmakers necessarily, but all right. So one example I had in mind was to talk about today. If you don't mind me spoiling one of the examples I had in mind to talk about today, does anyone mind? Like if I do that?
No.
Okay. Okay, one thing I was going to talk about was the Pokemon Adventures manga, which it's a series I really like, but there's a lot of stuff, especially in the early chapters, that if the Pokemon Company International looked at that, they probably wouldn't greenlight it. Things like some of the characters being villains who weren't villains in the original, or like some Pokemon dying on screen, for example, that kind of thing. There's just some interesting stuff in there that you probably wouldn't see like in a more modern adaptation of this series. That's just sort of what I meant, sort of like a general theme for what I'm going for with this.
This is the same series as the gym leader crucifixion, right?
Oh yeah, that was in the black and white chapter, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that I don't think that one would fly at all if it started today. But I think when it comes to the Pokemon manga fandom, it's the one that's viewed the most fondly, because I think it is the most daring out of all of them.
Oh, right. And it's also probably been the most translated because I mean there is another really long running Pokemon manga, but it's like a Japanese gag manga where most of it hasn't been officially translated. So yeah, Pokemon Adventures probably has like, the biggest fandom within the Pokemon manga community. So, there's that.
With Pokemon as well, you can't forget how extremely well received the anime was, and has continued to be until very recently, until it ended. It has had very, 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 very many different spin-offs and movies, and the actual show has had so many different points and episodes. And generally, it's viewed more as like a standalone thing from the games at this point because of how fondly it's looked at that with most people.
Just sort of tangential to that, I'm currently looking at the IMDb list of the highest rated video game adaptations. Where do you think Pokemon, the animated series, lands on that list?
Well, I mean, I was looking through like the IMDb list that Alex sent earlier, and like pretty much all the adaptations were, that were in that list were in like a 4 to 7 range, but like those were all like, movies, not like, animated stuff or series or anything like that. So I would guess, like, just based on how like, most of the movies scored, I would say maybe like a 6 or 7 for the anime.
Just a quick question: are we talking about just the first season, or like a compilation of all the scores? Because if we're talking the first season, my guess is like a low to mid 7. It only like fluctuates below
I
that
need to
point.
jump in because I think you guys have misunderstood the question. The What it is it's a ranking of every video game adaptation by IMDb rating. So there's 105 on here. Where do
Oh,
you
you
think
mean
in that
like
list of
what its placement
105
is?
that Pokemon lands? And to answer your question, Cora, I believe it's the entirety of the series, including like all 1,000 episodes or however many it is now.
I'm gonna
Everything.
guess high 30s, 38.
I want to say like I'm gonna go a little more daring. I'm gonna say like top 20.
Nixon?
Uh, I'm not going to make a guess because I already know the answer because I have the actual page up for myself as well.
Okay,
And
well, yeah. So the answer is 2. It's second, believe it or not.
Oh, neat, neat.
So yeah, the only thing above it is Dungeons and Dragons, which was evidently some sort of kids' TV series back in 83 to 85. And that has an IMDb rating of 8. And that's the highest rated video game adaptation on IMDb. So that's I did not know that. So that's something I've learned today.
I mean, I personally feel kind of weird about counting that because I mean, Dungeons and Dragons was like a tabletop game at first. Like there might have been a video game adaptation in like the 80s, but like unless the show was like based specifically on that adaptation, which I doubt it was, I don't know.
I'm gonna call fair on that because I'll call tabletop video game in this specific instance because of its Dungeons and Dragons specific importance upon RPGs for the rest of time, specifically classes, stats, and whatnot. But I'd like to call a slight foul on that ranking because both Edge Runners and Arcane are higher rated than 8 at an 8.4 and a 9.0 respectively.
I do believe the reason that is because this was made like earlier in 2022, So, or the updated was like early 2022, late 2021. So neither of those had come out yet at that stage.
Yeah, that makes sense because like I was looking at the list in chronological order, by release, and like they haven't had like the Super Mario Brothers movie on here yet, for example. So there's some 2022 stuff that's missing.
But I also think that goes to show how the more recent adaptations are very much changing the paradigm on people's opinions of video games adapted in this medium. When two of the highest rated ones on IMDb are from the last 2 years, it kind of shows that this is a very recent development.
Oh, yeah, I also just noticed there's no Castlevania listed for some reason.
The more I look at this list, the more is missing. Like, it's odd because, like, okay, so we can explain why Edge Runners isn't there, because I think that's the most recent one, and yes, it seems like the list was made a little bit earlier in the year. But Arcane came out at least 1 year ago, and does not seem to be on there. Even though other 2021 movies are and 2022 is, I can't see it anywhere. And I'm almost certain that would be number one, because that is a very popular series. So, not sure what's going on there.
Added onto this, Arcane came in November of last year, and this list was last updated in August of last year. So there was a very brief period of time before Arcane was released that this was released in.
Only Castlevania was missing because that's an 8.3, and that was 2017.
Okay, but if it was done in November last year, why the hell is Sonic the Hedgehog 2 there when that came out this year?
And I'd also like to point out that okay, they had the live action Street Fighter movie listed, and they had the Legend of Chun-Li listed, but like they don't have like the Street Fighter cartoon listed. They don't have the Street Fighter 2 the anime. They don't have the Street Fighter 2 animated movie. There's a lot of stuff. I don't have any of the SNK related OVAs either. Like there's a lot of stuff missing from this list, even not accounting for just when it was made.
All right, we're making an executive decision. This list is shit. I am very fuming at Carmelolia, who made the list, who has not kept it perfectly up to date for our very specific podcast episode. But yeah, we can't. Yeah, I know, right? We cannot take this as gospel, and I am almost certain Dungeons & Dragons is not the highest rated IMDb game adaptation. So we'll just ignore the last 10 minutes of conversation. Okay, cool. Someone else pick up with like some... Why don't one of you discuss one of the games you wanted to talk about more specifically?
Yeah, just to kind of wrap up what we were saying about the earlier stuff. I think that they kind of fell into two major categories, and you guys can agree or disagree with me. The first category was the Passion Project. I do actually fully believe that Resident Evil falls under this Passion Project because I believe the directors have gone on record saying that they, love the franchise. The other is kind of I don't know if it's a marketing move or just the cash grab. I think the best example is probably the Tomb Raider series because they did bring in some competent people for it. It just, was average. And I think that in terms of late 90s, early 2000s, that's kind of the best that you can hope for.
Okay, so in terms of passion projects, I did just talk about Pokemon Adventures, but like I do feel like that also applies because like when you read some of the author's notes from Hidenori Kusaka at the end of the volumes, you can tell this guy like really likes Pokemon. He spends all his time like talking about the games or like some weird impulse buys that he made based on Pokemon stuff. I heard once I remember reading in one of the author's notes that he very briefly considered buying a car just because its name was Ruby, Red, Pearl, and those are like the names of three of the games all mashed together. Yeah, that's just an example. And you can tell also just from reading it how many of the game mechanics are referenced, like the fact that you can see the Pokemon sprites in the Pokedex images. It's yeah, you can tell the guy really likes the Pokemon games, and that's why the series started in the 90s, and like he has kept the manga going to this day, even with having to juggle it between like two different monthly publications. and all the crazy scheduling stuff that's gone on since then. Like there was like a 5-year gap between the volume releases, just because of like internal delays and stuff like that. And they still kept going with the series in the magazines just because he's just that into Pokemon. And there is also an income factor as well. Like it is what he does for a living. It is what he's known for. But at the same time, you can tell like when he has passion for what he's writing about, it really seeps into the manga.
Yeah, and I think that we see that with a lot of the more successful adaptations of the early ages, is that it was something that the people that were involved were very passionate about, and it wasn't as much a Hollywood cash grab without really understanding this rising video game user subculture. Um, and so and honestly, that really persisted probably until Castlevania. I think Castlevania is the first real big, like, very visible nation where I think the director went on record to say that he never played the game, and that really lends into what I believe to be the biggest plus point in these newer adaptations, and that is that they are not trying to adapt the story of the game. They are doing something off to the side that references the game and the world and the characters, but aren't touching main stuff inside it.
There is an adaptation I'm considering talking about that, does sort of do something like that, where, it doesn't focus too much on sticking to the established timeline of the story and just wants to tell its own thing. But, I'll get to that when we get to it. But yeah, that is definitely an interesting way to handle the adaptation, where instead of like trying to do the story beat by beat, they instead focus on telling an original story in the same world with the same characters. And, sometimes that works really well. In fact, I remember, sort of behind the scenes on this episode, we were talking about maybe doing sort of a good, bad, and ugly sort of theme for how you're going to cover this. And, one of the issues I have with one of the adaptations I considered for the bad category, again, not to spoil anything, when we get to that, is, one of the adaptations I was going to talk about actually, arguably tries to stick way too close to the games. And as a result, it tries to fit, way too many plot beats in there at once, and it gets hard to follow. But yeah, that is just a good point you made. How sometimes it can be worthwhile just to make your own story rather than trying to adapt one directly.
I think now's the perfect time to get into it if you want to talk about it a bit, and then I'll just follow up with continuation point of what I just said.
Okay. So did you want me to start with that one adaptation I was talking about that sort of did a side story, or did you want me to talk about like the one that I thought maybe tried to fit too much of the story in there at once?
Other one that does too much.
Okay, so all right, we were talking before, about different Street Fighter movies, different Resident Evil movies. How many of you guys know that back in like 2012, there was a movie that was only released in Japan based on Ace Attorney? Like, how many of you knew that?
Not me.
Not you?
I
Okay, yeah.
I knew of it, but I didn't actually watch it or see any media related to it. It kind of just like glazed over on like a news page.
Okay, yeah. So I've seen this twice. There was a period where it was on YouTube, and the first time I did generally enjoy it because there are some good aspects of that adaptation. Like all right, so it's based directly on the first game, and it does feature most of the characters from that game, and they all and the costume work in that movie is really good. You see Phoenix, and yeah, that's Phoenix. He's got the blue suit. He's got the slicked back hair. Like it might look a little silly, but that works for Ace Attorney. You got Maya looking right, Edgeworth looking right, all that stuff, and it's really cool. But the problem is, it tries to fit literally every single case from that first game into the movie, and because they have to rush those plot points so fast, yet a lot of the stuff that they established early on, like the 3-day trial system and stuff like that, and a lot of important points about the case those get skimmed over and like downplayed so much, and a lot of the characters' personalities get lost too. Like how the judge in these Attorney games is like arguably the funniest character because he always has like those sort of sort of those quirky eccentric lines. Like pretty much none of that's there. The judge is boring as shit in that movie. I'm sorry because they give no time to actually flesh out his personality. He's just like the old man who bangs the gavel and that's it. It's yeah, and there's also like Red White. He's in this movie too, but like he's not really given any personality either. Even though he was like one of the flashier characters in the game, stuff like that, where they rush through the plot beats, and if you're really focusing, you can sort of make sense of it. But it loses a lot of the personality from those games as a result, and that's part of why people like Ace Attorney. So I think doing something like Cora mentioned, where instead of focusing on adapting one story from the games, if they just made an original case for this movie that they could have spent pretty much all their time and energy on, I think that would have worked much better for it.
Right, and you do see that with Edge Runners and Arcane. So, for any of you that hasn't watched it, Edge Runners is CD Projekt Red's anime adaptation of their take on the cyberpunk world based upon the book that came out, I think, in the late 80s. And this story was set in 2076, so 1 year before the actions of the game, and covers a completely different character, but references some of the same locale and some of the same quote unquote legends that you will see in the game. And that is a similar beat Arcane did, where you look at the backstory of two characters that you can play in the game. And both of those adaptation choices, especially considering what kind of adaptation, what kind of game they're adapting, kind of dodges all of the pitfalls that you would get if you try to do a straight up adaptation. Because if you did an adaptation of a multi-pathed RPG, you're essentially canonizing one path and also cutting out most of the content that you would get to try to do a streamlined start to finish. And then with a game like League, which is very nebulous and only happens on one map, trying to explain that game through a show would be a guaranteed bomb, in my opinion. I think by sidestepping, making an original story that happens beforehand, you're not trapped by the current canon, and it gives you some wiggle room to be very creative.
Yeah, I agree with that because I remember, like, a lot of people were talking really positively, about like the cyberpunk anime when that came out, and I think being a prequel does a lot of good for it because you do get more creative freedom if you don't have to worry necessarily about what's already been established in the timeline. I mean, you do have to make sure you don't make too many continuity errors. Like, oh, this happened here when the knock-on effects couldn't have happened a year later, but in general, you're generally more free to just talk about stuff that happened in the world before it's like, before what it's like when you get to it in the game. And, I think that's a pretty good approach, one that, could work, depending on the kind of story you want to tell.
Alex, do you and Para have anything you want to add to that?
Nothing from me, sorry.
I don't have anything specifically to Edge Runners or Arcane because, well, I already pretty much got my entire point put through by both of you. One thing I do want to add with how well received something like Edge Runners was, the anime essentially fully resurrected the game from complete dead to like back to being on the charts, which is like something not seen before in any sort of way, at least from what I know of. And in a similar vein of how those shows have like a separate story from the games, something very early on established would be like Pokemon that has the same thing. While they have like a similar style of how it works, the actual Pokemon games have way less of a story than the anime, for example, does. And the anime doesn't follow anything specific out of the games, other than like certain characters, at least to my knowledge.
I would say there's maybe an exception for like the Gen 5 stuff, but for the most part, yeah, I would generally agree with that.
The funny thing about all three of those examples is that they are ads. Let's be honest, they're ads. And Edge Runners came out at a perfect time to revitalize a game that had a dreadful launch and push it back up the numbers. I mean, I'm no exception. I even booted up the game after finishing it in dismay, a year ago to see if it was actually playable because some of those missions I couldn't finish, and I had a fairly enjoyable time. Like it's still nowhere near I think what was pitched, but it's functional. And I think that it was really they did a couple patches right before, and it was very very good time, very opportune time to post it. And I think Arcane, no one was pretending that it wasn't anything but an ad to get into their IP. And I don't think, and I think everyone knows the Pokemon show was an ad for the games and the merchandise to get people and thinking about it.
Yeah, more or less, because I mean, especially with how they market the anime nowadays, like with the Gen 6 and Gen 7 animes, they put the advertising for it focuses a lot on stuff like the Mega Evolution, the Z moves, the different regional forms. Basically, it's basically a highlight reel of all the neat, interesting stuff from the games that they from the Pokemon Company's logic, should make you want to go out and play the games. So yeah, that is definitely the main purpose of the anime, even if it does also have the secondary purpose of just being a fun and engaging show.
Yeah. So I had a point and it slipped my brain. Sorry for the silence. But I think in the future, I don't know where the next really good IP moment is going to be, but I think that anyone like these game companies, anyone that's going to do adaptation in the future is probably going to look towards this adjacent story approach.
So I would like to discuss, cycling back to our conversation earlier a little bit about how video game adaptations tend to succeed more when it's sort of like an original story in the same universe and not doing a beat for beat. And historically, if it's not that, it's usually an adaptation of the original story, as in it kind of takes a lot of the familiar elements but does it in its own way. Something like Uncharted, for example, sort of took a lot of familiar elements from the games and mashed them together to make their own story. Now, early next year, we're getting The Last of Us TV series on HBO. Now, as far as I can see, that is going to be near enough a beat-for-beat remake, and it certainly seems to be that way from the trailer they released and all the press release and stuff so far. But given the widespread success and high acclaim of The Last of Us, especially the first game, and its general cinematic nature in the first place, I actually don't know if any of you guys have even played it, but I'm sure you know it by reputation, if nothing else. Do you think that series can succeed where others hasn't by being a beat for beat remake, if that is indeed the direction they're going with it?
Do you mind if I start? Because like I did play the original Last of Us when it came out back in like 2013. And like before I even get into that, I just want to, I just want to find it funny how, it's been less than 10 years since that game came out, and we've gotten what, the third beat for beat remake of it. Okay, we got The Last of Us, we got the PS4 remaster, we got The Last of Us Part One, the remake on PS5, and now we got the movie or the TV series. There seems to be like a beat for beat retelling. I just find it kind of funny how, and we have had side stories before. Like we had the Left Behind DLC, we had the comics, we had the sequel, but yeah, this is just like I think like the fourth retelling of that original story. But I do think it can work. Like there is like a strong character dynamic between Joel and Ellie. You have like this grizzled guy who knows what life was like before. The for lack of a better word, the pandemic versus, Ellie, who sort of grew up in that. And, there's like a fun, sort of interesting dynamic between them. You can see how their different perspectives bounce off each other. And, I think, that could, like, carry a more character driven, like, TV series if you wanted it to. And, there's also a neat world there. Like, you see how society has sort of adapted and, also fallen apart, but still sort of adapted to, life with, the cordyceps going around. So, yeah, I think that could actually make for a pretty interesting series.
Yeah, no, I think it's especially with Sony's first party IPs. This is just an obvious example, The Last of Us, because it is coming out soon. I think so many of them could so very easily be adapted to TV. Now, another example is Horizon, and that's getting a Netflix series. Something like God of War, I believe, is also being adapted. They have so many of their cinematic first-person games can so very easily be adapted, and I don't think they would even need that much changing to be successful. I think one argument or one aspect I'd like to talk about in terms of the whole how you adapt these series is that it's very easy to say there's no point in adapting something beat for beat, but you have to remember that the amount of people who might be exposed to a Hollywood movie or to a Netflix TV series or something is going to be significantly larger than people who may end up playing a game of that sort of caliber. So a story that has been told in one medium could also be extremely potent still in another medium and reach a far wider audience of people who don't know the story yet. So I am very intrigued to see where the Last of Us story goes and how it's received, especially since HBO has a bit of a reputation of producing fairly high quality cinematic content. If you think of the likes of Game of Thrones, I can't think off the top of my head, but they make a lot of like top series. So very interested to see where that one goes myself.
I only had one more show to bring up, which shares some form in the way that it has a separate story from the games, but it does it in a different way than any other does, because it essentially creates the story for the actual game as well, which would be the Cuphead show that came out relatively recently. That essentially, because in the actual game, the story is very, very loose, and in general, it is told in very small pieces. The way in the show it is said, it fills in those pieces and gives out actual lore behind all of the characters, other than they made a deal with the devil and now need their souls collected, which I think is really, really nice. And the way it's animated and the way that, in general, the story moves on is really, really well made.
I did remember hearing once that, like, the series sort of ended almost like being a prequel to the games, because like what you're describing, with them making a deal with the devil and, having to collect soul contracts and stuff like that. Like, that is a thing that happened in the prologue of the original game. But I also heard that, like, okay, so how, like, that little bit where, they made the deal with the devil happened in the Devil's Casino, and how at the end of the Cuphead show, you see them, like, going to the casino where that happens. So, it is kind of fun how, again, they sort of use the Cuphead show as an opportunity to add some more lore to the characters in this world, while also setting up the game that the show is based on. So like, that is, like, a really neat approach. Essentially giving more context to the game.
Yeah, I just to change gears really quick back to Para's original question. The thing I think that works in The Last of Us's advantage compared to some other games is that its story is linear. There are few deviations, and I do not believe that there are any alternative endings. No Easter eggs or anything like that that would give you a different end screen. So you don't have to worry about skipping any side content or picking a canonization of the ending. And the way in which The Last of Us was crafted um, already makes it very cinematic. So I think that the only differences that we'll really see in the HBO show is maybe some additional content in the forms of be a couple extra storylines. But if any game is going to be able to make this work and pull it off, I think The Last of Us has the most compatible structure with a watching medium.
All right, so we've quite thoroughly gone over a large number of talking points in regards to games being adapted into other media, but I would like us to move over now to discussing things the other way around. So we're going to discuss media that has been adapted into games. So again, could be comic books, could be books, could be movies, TV shows, whatever you want it to be. Board games, anything like that. Obviously, there is so many examples of this. You think like the Spider-Man and Batman games, the old movie video tie-in games that used to happen all the time, quite notorious for the level of shovelware that used to be back in the day. The Middle-earth Shadow of War games, things like that. There's so many, and they are kind of like an evergreen presence in video games. They've been around forever and still are quite popular. They have taken many different forms in terms of how they choose to do them over the years. But I would actually like to open up the talking on the subject myself, because I have there's been a raft of games lately, I want to say within the past six or so years, where they take films from the 80s or the 90s or something like that, and they will adapt it into a maybe not necessarily unexpected genre, but they take it in a direction that I think, in my experience at least, usually ends up being a fairly unexceptional video game in its own right. But as adaptations of that universe, they do a really good job. So examples off the top of my head are Aliens Fireteam Elite, which came out last year. So this is obviously based on the Alien film series, but it does a really good job of giving you the power fantasy of being a colonial marine in that series. You've got the Ghostbusters video game, which worked as an extremely serviceable sequel to the two movies before, obviously, Afterlife came out many years later. The Back to the Future Telltale video game, which was also a very serviceable sequel. These are games that are not overly... They're not Game of the Year contenders or anything like that, but in terms of integrating themselves into the game universes and allowing you to explore that universe and be a part of it, they do an absolutely brilliant job of doing it. I don't know if any of you guys have sort of examples you also have of that sort of experience, but it's something I've noticed more of in recent years. Like just a couple days ago for Black Friday, I got Starship Troopers Terran Command. Really enjoying that so far. It basically takes the game and makes it into an RTS. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, I have to say, I think this is something that's definitely improved significantly in recent years from where movie video games used to be.
I can't speak to a specific game that fits under that umbrella. I do think that what you're saying lends to a trend in video game adaptations of media where they were once, very cheap. Well, I don't know how cheap they were to make, but they had to have been if so many studios were just pumping them out in the most random places on these shovelware games. But I think they were just to advertise for the main movie, the DVD sales, or just trying to scrape out a couple extra dollars, where I feel like a lot of the new AAA or even indie games that are adaptations are trying to take the medium that already exists and adapt it in a way that it can become its own standalone game. I think that the Spider-Man adaptation is a good example of that. Really, anything along those genre lines.
I actually have to add a very specific company that expertise or generally has expertised themselves in making video game adaptations of other media. And it's not the people who make the Lego games, even though they also at least sort of do that. I am willing to bet most of you have heard of Telltale Games with stuff like The Walking Dead or The Wolf Among Us or the Batman series, etc.
Yeah, I've heard of them. I remember they were really big back in the early 2010s and stuff.
They are generally my big point of very, very well-made story-based games based on other stories, because they still focus on the more cinematic parts of the actual media instead of the game part. But the game part is still in there enough that it can be just not like a playable movie, but it's still like a game.
Yeah, I mean, like from what I remember, they are generally like visual novel slash point and click kind of games, and that works if you're trying to adapt like a really heavily story based piece of media. I think. I mean, it does depend. Obviously, that there are cases where maybe a different game format would work better, but yeah, like I do think that is generally like a pretty solid approach if you're adapting. Something like The Walking Dead, for example, where there is like a bigger story focus where there might be a bit of action, but it's not a big focus or anything. So yeah, I can sort of agree with you on that.
I think with the Telltale games, especially, it's that they are very simple, aren't they? They're such simple games, and that's why they were able to churn out so many in such a short space of time. But is again starting back to our earlier point, they did the best ones certainly did such a good job of adapting and integrating themselves into the currently existing world, or just creating a brand new alternate universe of their own. Now, I never finished it, but the Batman Telltale series was very popular. It basically created its own version of Batman, and it took pre-existing and very familiar plot threads and sort of just did their own thing with them. So, for example, they made Vicky Vale into a villain, from what I remember. The Joker, I believe, you kind of saw his origin, and he had a very different origin to how we're used to in the comics and stuff like that. So they kind of took a pre-existing thing and not necessarily adapted it, but took it and placed it in a whole other universe and made their own thing out of it. And the best Telltale games succeeded by doing that, whereas some others, such as, for example, Game of Thrones, tried really hard to integrate itself into the while it was never canon, it tried to integrate itself into the TV series by bringing on actors and actresses from the series, like Lena Headey, Natalie Dormer, Peter Dinklage. So it felt like part of the series, but the problem was the Game of Thrones series ended up feeling a bit flat, really. It went on too long, and it was just really fucking depressing from what I remember. It was, it just fell a bit flat in general because it tried too hard to make itself like the series rather than doing its own thing, and kind of failed in that respect. So there's definitely a double-edged sword there in terms of the direction you can take it in and how to adapt that simplicity. So yeah, Telltale Games, bit of a cautionary tale in terms of how you handle these sorts of adaptations, really.
I want to raise a quick question, unless Max, you have something along that line that's relevant before I change topics.
Not particularly. You can go ahead.
Just really quickly, since on our last, the first half, the last topic that we had was about creating something separate yet identifiable within the medium that they were pulling from. Now that, do you think that it is the way forward in the reverse? Because we have this new Harry Potter game coming out that is set within the Wizarding world, but it is a different time period, and it's an original story. And do you think that that would make a more compelling game than trying to do the old adaptations of following along with Harry and trying to insert yourself into that kind of side content?
I think from my perspective for Harry Potter, I think it's quite a unique situation because people have been crying out for a free roam Hogwarts game for so long. And I think regardless of where they had placed it in the timeline or what they'd done with it, I think people would have really loved it, because what they want is that opportunity to be a witch or a wizard, enroll in Hogwarts, play Quidditch. I know you can't do that in this upcoming game, but, go to classes, do all that sort of thing. I don't think in this very specific case that it would have mattered when or where they did the game. It's just that if it offers you the opportunity to do the things everyone's always wanted to do, then it's going to succeed. But at least that's the way I view it.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say that, from what little I remember of trying to play the EA Harry Potter games, yeah, that approach might work better just because, you can only go up.
Okay. Yeah, maybe that wasn't the best example. And also, obviously, with the creator of the IP's current popularity, maybe excitement for that game's been tempered a bit. I do think that I think you just said Lord of the Rings. That I think that as an adaptation was good because it allowed for an original story within the. I think it's kind of an AU, isn't it? Like an alternate timeline, um, which I think is quite fascinating. Um, I played both of those games and I thought that they were very engaging outside of getting kind of bored of the gameplay loop, but I found the idea encouraging.
Yeah, just wanted to confirm. Yes, it's an alternate universe thing because it takes place a couple hundred years before The Hobbit, but it takes established lore and just takes it in a completely different direction. Like, if any of you have seen the recent Lord of the Rings series on Amazon Prime, you will know there's a couple of characters that sort of, or at least one character that crosses over, and it's very different. So they've just taken it in extremely different directions. But yeah, just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. That's just my opinion though, is that I think games along those lines will be the more successful adaptations as they do something brave and different and establish themselves in a way that isn't reliant on the source material.
Yeah. So I would like to move the conversation on to going back a bit further in time. So cycle your mind back to the early 2000s. So we're going to say somewhere in the region between like, basically 2000 to 2010. So I did touch on this very slightly earlier, but this was an era where every movie, every TV show, every animated show, everything had a game tie-in. And more often than not, they would be extremely cheaply made. They would be extremely poor, and they would basically be rushed out with minimum cost to coincide with the release of a movie or TV series or animated show, just to make a bit of extra money when they came out. But that being said, there were a few gems in there, but my lord, there was also a lot of trash. And I think it's interesting, or comforting at least, to see that that trend definitely died out. I want to say around about 2012, 2013, I think, is when we started seeing that really stop. Obviously, that was the Wii was a big driver of that as well. The PS2, those games, those sort of consoles that had millions of games on them, and as development costs got higher in general, things like that started dropping off. But the quality has increased in terms of adaptations, has increased exponentially the less games have come out. Which, I mean, that should be obvious. It's like the more focus you put on a game, the less shovelware there is. Of course, it's going to be better. But there was some absolute if you go back and look at some of these things that have been adapted, like TV shows like Deal or No Deal getting their own game, Family Feud getting its own game, because I'm not even talking about like traditional movies or anything here. I'm just about like random TV shows that, like, game shows and things getting adapted, and the level of effort in them was absolutely appalling. There was so many bad ones, so I am very grateful we've moved upon from that. But what I wanted to ask was, do you guys have any experience of that sort of, not necessarily shovelware game, but from that sort of era of movie to game or TV show to game adaptations that you found were really good, like a diamond in the rough sort of deal?
Well, I mean, I was a kid in like the 2000s, so yeah, I can attest that there were a lot of like shovelware movie tie-in games that I owned. I'm not ashamed of it. Like I said, I was a kid in the 2000s. We all had a few of those, but one that I do want to give a special mention to that was actually pretty decent was the SpongeBob movie game that came out, I think, in like 2003, 2004, whenever that movie came out. And I think the main reason why that was actually like a fairly decent game is because it was made by the same team that had earlier done SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom, which is like not specifically based on any particular SpongeBob media. It's just like it's just sort of a really good Banjo-Kazooie-esque platformer set in the SpongeBob world, and they just made the movie game from the bones of Battle for Bikini Bottom. So they kind of already had a working game, to build from. They just needed to craft worlds and boss fights around some of the scenes in the movie. So even if it was rushed to come out, they still weren't as crunched as a lot of the people making these kind of games would have been.
Yeah, I was also. It's not really a gem, but like the SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom was the best one. But if you would allow me to say something a bit crazy, I would like to blame George Lucas for all these shovelware games. And the reason why I say that is because, back in the 70s, when they did the contract for the original Star Wars trilogy, he took a big cut of the merchandising percentage, maybe even all 100% of it, because it wasn't a thing. And when all those action figures and game sets and all that stuff came out, and he was making tens, hundreds of millions of dollars just off of these things that were tangential to the movies, all of these studios kind of sat there and were like, hold on a second, we got to start marketing as well. And you saw a lot of shows and movies that sometimes were just directly to market the toys. I mean, an entire subgenre of called Gundam was just made to sell the models. And I personally believe that in the 90s and 2000s, video games was just the next frontier of trying to push off merchandise on their IPs, and that's why we got all these low effort games just to make an extra dollar.
I 100% agree with that. It was clearly like dollar signs in their eyes, wasn't there, of like major movie companies seeing, oh wow, we can cheaply shove something out and make hundreds of thousands or millions in some cases just to get out like a basic game that was sell on brand value only. And it's also worth remembering back in those days, while the internet was around, not as many people had access to it, and you couldn't exactly check the Metacritic score of a game to see, oh no, this is complete trash, you should avoid that. It's like, unless you knew by word of mouth, you just get the game because all you had to sell you on was the back of the game case, basically. So you didn't know if it was bad or not, and you just kind of had to take the plunge and figure out if it was. So it was easy to kind of sucker people in with the right box art, with the right, just the right marketing tools to do it. So yeah, it was definitely a period of time where companies were able to sort of capitalize on not ignorance, but lack of ability to do to research things, I suppose. Very long-winded way of saying that.
There is one specific game that was full on based in a movie that kind of followed the same path as those, which I think basically everyone, or at least most people, would remember fondly, and that would be Spider-Man 2, that came out very, very shortly after the original Spider-Man 2 movie came out.
I know that game just for the pizza theme, and that's it.
Yeah, I never played that one myself, but I could name at least like several quotes from it just by proxy of being with people who have like Dr. Connor's class and stuff like that. It's I know its reputation as one of the sort of adaptation games that's more popular than or very well remembered, I guess, by those who played it at the time. But I will say also something like Spider-Man had a good basis to work off of because there was already some good Spider-Man games like on the PS1, for example. So they kind of had the mechanics and stuff to work off of, and they kind of had like a basis to work off of rather than just going in blind like some other adaptations would have done.
I only got whatever game my mom bought me. So in that way, she did buy me a lot of shovelware games because she would be in the store and she would say, "Oh, I know what this is. I've seen it on TV." And as a 8, 9, 10-year-old, you only know what games are marketed at you when you're watching Saturday morning cartoons, and you're like, "I want that one." So I actually have a lot of experience with these shovelware games. Like I had a Gurren Adventures of Billy and Mandy fighting game. I had Shrek Kart. I had some Fairly Odd Parents game on the Game Boy. I had a bunch of stuff, and most of them, if not all of them, were bad.
The Billy and Mandy fighting game was actually really fun. It was basically like another Power Stone.
That one was an exception.
There was also like this obsession as well, wasn't there, with adapting series into genres that were just so unfitting for the source material. Now, you mentioned Shrek karting, obviously, but there's this obsession with adapting strange franchises to kart racing. So there was a Star Wars Episode 1 kart racer called Star Wars Bombad Racing, where it wasn't even necessarily just pod racing. It was just like you took the characters, like chippied them and put them in go-karts and you just drove around the courses. There was this absolute... I don't know what it was. I guess it just appealed to kids quite a bit, but you would find the strangest games be given not necessarily just kart races, but like all sorts of like Simpsons wrestling, for example, is another one I can think of like where the hell did that come from? like what was the idea behind that? It's just you do just tend to get this tendency to have these almost nonsensical adaptations in terms of the genre they choose to use.
And we can't thank you for I was going to say Madagascar cart and Garfield cart, but they got posted in the chat. One thing I would like to also give some credit to, or as a contributing factor to kind of the wane off of some of these adaptations, was also, if you recall, when Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon and the Disney Channel had their big browser game craze. When they had sometimes their own specific domains, and sometimes it was just on the Cartoon Network website and you could play a bunch of mini games. I think that in the 2006 and later kind of sucked up a bunch of those firmware adaptations, those shovelware adaptations.
I think the biggest one out of the ones you mentioned was that one Cartoon Network had in the 2000s, Fusion Fall. It was basically like an alternate universe MMO kind of thing that was like a bunch of Cartoon Network worlds fused together, and I didn't play it as a kid, but I probably would have liked it. It was definitely interesting, and I know like the servers for that game have gone down. Obviously it's been over a decade, but I think people are still trying to keep it alive, and that's pretty neat.
Yeah, I just wanted to chip in and say I think I remember that game. I think I know the one you're talking about. I didn't watch Cartoon Network as a kid because it was like a separate paid channel service in the UK and my family couldn't afford it at the time, but I remember going over to my friend's house and playing that game. It was like a browser-based sort of like... It was sort of like a progenitor for sort of games that came on later down the line of like a crossover multiversal sort of thing. And I just wanted to say I distinctly remember that. That was you just opened a memory for me there.
No, I'm actually going through like a bunch of video games based on films, and there is a huge trend like between 2007 and like 2013 where there's like a lot of games like Wall-E or Madagascar or Kung Fu Panda or like Disney, Pixar, DreamWorks stuff that all had like a very, very similar vibe to them. Like they all had a similar style to the actual movies, but they were like really, really pixelated. And they all had like the collect this item, go to this place, do this thing. And they all were based in like specific scenes from the movies.
Monsters Inc. Scare Island. Did you ever play that?
I did actually.
Yeah, that fit the description perfectly. Because like it was like it wasn't an adaptation of the movies. It was like I don't even know if I want to say it was set before the movie, but it's basically like you play as Michael Sully and you basically go through all like scare training, and like it was very similar to how you described. It was like there was no relevance to the movie really whatsoever. It was a collectathon platformer with a Monsters Inc. skin. Like, and yeah, there was definitely a fair few of those type of games.
And all the games just like that would be like there was one about Ratatouille at the early 2007, which was exactly like that, where you would just go around a random kitchen with random rats and you'd collect random items. 90% of the time you didn't even make food in the game or have any relation to food.
This kind of goes back to what I said earlier. It's just like I get adapting something like, okay, let's say for example Toy Story or The Incredibles. There's games you could naturally make out of those, but something like Ratatouille, you can't make a game out of that fits the original source material. Like, okay, there are cooking games out there, but let's be real about this. How is Ratatouille going to make a good game? Like, there was just don't do it. Just like, if you're making a film about, haute cuisine in Paris, where it's literally just a rat making food, like, what can you do with that? Like, where does the collectathon come from? Like, what does this have to do with anything? It's just absolutely wild to me that we used to have so many of those.
Turn it into a cooking game business sim hybrid. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, I kind of feel like if it had come out nowadays, they could have made it work. But yeah, back in the day, certainly much harder.
Yeah, like with janky PS2 graphics and janky PS2 everything, essentially, it would just be it was a horrible experience. And the amount of like games that happened to that, like, it didn't fit. Like, I understand something like Shrek, because the world in the actual movie is very vast. But then there's games like Surf's Up, which is essentially just a Happy Feet ripoff. Or kind of, which, alongside the Happy Feet games as well, just don't fit the entire concept of a video game. They're essentially just reliving moments from scenarios from the movie, but they're not actually the scenarios in the movie. They're just the general places where you do different things, where you collect random things. It was such a big trend that, like, half of these games I could list off as one of those games.
I'm sorry, there was a Happy Feet game? Really?
Multiple.
I think
I
there
believe.
was, yeah.
Wow, that's I can't. Okay, yeah, I don't know. I shouldn't be surprised based on the conversations we've been having, but I am a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, I am.
It was on the PS2 and the Wii. Both of them as well.
Now it makes sense. Those two consoles, my god, the shovelware, like, good lord, the stuff that was on those consoles.
Sending a few pictures to the actual chat so you can see the level of what we're at.
Oh, it was a dancing
the rhythm
game.
Okay.
No. It was that for the bottom part was 90% of the game. The dancing was like 1%, and then there's some filler.
For the benefit of the viewers at home, basically the screenshots are, one was a dancing game, and then another is, what is that, like a snowboarding thing, or like, yeah, it looks at something like that.
It was half snowboarding or like sliding down a hill, and then half just going underwater doing the same exact thing.
I would have loved to have been in like the the ideas room at the developers for these companies, just sitting there racking their brains thinking, how the hell do we make this into a game? What should we do? It's like, oh, penguins are in snow. We could have a snowboarding mini game, just that's the I can't imagine it was like any deeper than that, their thought process, because they had to be like, they're just cling on to things like that. Yeah, I do not envy the developers who had to work on things like these. But though some of them did come out well, to be fair. One thing I do actually want to, or one game series I do actually want to mention, and a couple of people here might have played it, is the Lord of the Rings games. So Two Towers, Return of the King. But other than just the straight adaptations, you had The Third Age, which was like a JRPG type game. The Battle of Middle-earth games, which are like Star Wars Battlefront. They were generally fairly high quality adaptations that were all quite good and quite. I'm not gonna pretend they were like Game of the Year winners, but like, pretty consistent quality across a franchise, I found, at least with them.
Also, just for a tiny brief moment to go back to the Happy Feet one, I'm going through like specific screenshots of the game, and there are like some scenes that, for being a game for 3-year-olds and above, I believe it was, some of these screens in the actual game would be something that I would be absolutely fucking terrified of as a 3-year-old. Like, these are not things that you could put into a video game nowadays for 3-year-olds plus.
Leopard seals do be scary, I guess.
Yeah, for the benefit of the listeners, it's a picture of a leopard seal chasing a penguin. And admittedly, I do agree, as a kid, that would have terrified me.
Also,
I mean, I don't think it's that much scarier than, like, the eel in Mario 64 or whatever. But yeah, I could see some kids getting a little freaked out by that.
Also, as far as I remember, you do actually get eaten by the leopard seals in the game if you lose to them.
Oh, fun.
Um, I kind of want to do is if anyone has off the top of their head what the worst adapted game they've played or what show they've watched. I can start in case anyone needs time. I know this isn't a game to movie adaptation, but it was so bad I think it needs just to be shouted out is the Western live action Dragon Ball movie. I think that's probably the worst adapted anything that I've ever watched in my life. Don't at me Avatar fans because that one is by far the worst. And I'm just gonna have to go back to Shrek Kart again because that game was just unplayable.
All right. Just want to give a shout out to the King of Fighters movie. I would say aspects of that are very similarly bad to Dragon Ball Evolution, but yeah, just wanted to give a quick shout to that. I'm also like, if you know anything about King of Fighters lore, just reading the Wikipedia plot description for the KOF movie is like, it's worth a laugh on its own.
So I'm just gonna be a bit cheap and just go back to what I said earlier, which is the Paul W.S. Anderson Resident Evil movies. It may be cheating a little bit for me to pick a series of 6 movies, but there was some real stinkers in there, especially the fifth and sixth movies. I think were the terrible ones. Like not very good. And the tiny thing was, like, I watched those movies, then played the games. Like, I played the games quite late, so I can really appreciate. It's not like it's a nostalgia thing, but they are poor. They're really poor. So yeah, it's definitely my pick.
The worst one that I've seen, which I watched specifically because it's rated so low, would be Tekken Kazuya's Revenge, which is one of the lowest rated video game based movies of all time.
All right, cool. So that is going to be that for today, ladies and gentlemen. That was our longest episode yet, and we've covered quite a bit of ground there, and all sorts of different adaptations across both ways there. I think the prevailing theme is, I think maybe they miss more often than they hit, but there's definitely some gems out there, just some diamonds in the rough, and there's definitely been a very interesting history of adaptations, and I think it's fair to say we're not necessarily in a golden era. We've definitely moved on from a terrible time back in the early 2000s, where it used to be so much worse. But yeah, thank you very much for tuning in and listening to this episode. We will be returning, hopefully, next week with a VGA preview episode where I'm hoping Jack will be making his TPOG debut. But until then, obviously, keep you guys updated. I've been Parasloth. This has been Nixon.
Thank you.
Cora.
Bye.
And Max.
See ya.
And we will see you at the next one. Bye.